somewhere in ancient Rome. Salve, Caesar.
Miles, quid postquam te per machinam temporis misi invenisti?
Lingua nostra, Domine, deleta est.
Quid?
Linguas novas locuntur, similes pueros toto quidentes non habet. Aspice quod verbo pater fecerunt.
Non pater?
Per factus est. Welcome back to the Criticizer of Conlangs with your host James Pigeon, and today the episode is on Neolatino romance, or simply Neolatino. Neolatino is a Romance zonal auxlang created in 2006 by Jordi, Cassany, Bates, and languished in relative obscurity until around 2019, when the language started to gain a lot more traction online. The goal of Neolatino is to be a language which is familiar to speakers of the Romance subfamily, and give them an easy way to communicate with each other. This is the second zonal auxlang seen on this channel, if anybody remembers the much maligned Mino episode from a few weeks ago. So, unlike the Germanic languages, the Romance languages are generally pretty intelligible, at least in writing, maybe with the major exceptions of French and Portuguese and Romanian, and okay, maybe they're not that intelligible. To mention, I should also be a bit more qualified for this episode than for Mino, because I am a second language speaker of a Romance language, Spanish, and I've studied French, Portuguese, and Latin to a less fluent degree, in that order. And now to the mission statement, from some of the few English resources on Neolatino. Quote, in order to cease and also dignify today's inter-and pan-Latin communication, the Via Neolatino project has restored and updated the Latin language, the traditional common standard. The resulting language model is a synthesis of the Romance variation which aims to be representative of the whole family. Neo-Latin is a pan-Latin standard language, a new and common, while at the same time a natural and flexible Romance variety, which eases communication for the whole Latin world, complementing the regional standards that exist. Uses and benefits. Understandable by 800 million people. Adaptable to meet specific needs and interests. Introduction to Romance languages for foreigners. Bridge to present in old Romance languages in Latin. Easier with knowledge of Neo-Latin. More effective than English for machine translation between Romance languages. It limits Anglo-Saxon imperialism. Shelter for speakers of vanishing Romance languages. It enriches and improves Romance with contributions from all its varieties. So the goals here are to be understandable, naturalistic, and representative. Neolatino wants speakers of all of its source languages to be able to easily understand Neolatino and quickly adapt to it. Now this is anecdotal, but listen up. Neolatino's resources are almost entirely in Neolatino, bold move, and are purposed to speakers of its target languages, like how the online dictionary only accepts input from Romance languages, not English. If I only knew English, I would have been fried, but as a Romance L2 enjoyer, reading Neolatino felt very natural to me, and I could easily understand the ideas presented. Soon I was even writing in Neolatino. This showed, in my opinion, that the first goal was broadly achieved. The second goal is to be natural. Not as a commenter said, a cheap language, utilitarian, might be more generous to the tokiponas of the world, to essentially have enough grammatical complexity and irregularity to feel like a real and beautiful natural language, and to be able to express complex ideas. This is more in the line of Kotava, which, while being a global IAL, was very naturalistic with grammar complex enough to be widely usable. This is in contrast to, say, Latino Cineflex One, which is meant to be very simple to pick up and is extremely regular, even being criticized for not having enough grammar. As I mentioned in that episode, this approach comes with substantial pros and cons. But yeah, Neolatino functions by intention as more of a natural evolution of Vulgar Latin that was guided to be good auxlang than an engineered and completely regular language. And third, the goal of being representative of the entire family. This is the goal in which it feels like Neolatino was the least successful. This will be touched on more later on in the video, but Neolatino seems a bit biased to Italian in terms of phonology. Bit of a weird choice, since Spanish and Portuguese have about 3 times more speakers than the rest combined, so if they had to make the phonology biased, maybe bias it that way. Anyway, this is more minor, but the source languages were Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian, Romanian, and Catalan. But these aren't the 6 most spoken Romance languages. Number 6 is Haitian Creole. Now, Haitian Creole derived from French and not Latin directly, so it's pretty fair because all of its Latinate vocabulary is similar to French anyway, but still, Haitian Creole erasure is wild. Now, the phonology. This is a good natural phonology with a few issues. I highlighted the phonemes that don't appear in at least one of the big 5 Romance languages, and there aren't that many. Just note that to be generous, I allowed any dialect I knew about that had the phoneme to save it, so just because Paraguayan Spanish has sh, it gets to stay, for example. Still, having a big phonology is more naturalistic. Just don't tell that to Rhodocast speakers. It makes for a really good-sounding language, in my opinion. Now, the part I mentioned earlier about it seeming, in my uneducated opinion, a bit biased to Italian is because it has gemination, which is, listen, consonant gemination is very based, but it's a really weird choice here because most Romance languages have lost it. Also, unlike most of the others, Italian has, with the exception of the tap R, every phoneme of the chart, so its speakers also get a big advantage on that. And the sound of C before E and I is ce, which is again more intuitive to Italians, and again, it calls its preterite tense the remote past, which is what Italians call it. Alright, the vowels. The vowels are generally fine. It's a 7-vowel system where the 2 extra are basically just light versions of E and O, being e and a. This is generally fine because most Romance languages aren't as bare bones as Spanish when it comes to vowels. Also, the community of Neolatino seems pretty Europe-pilled in general, which is fine. But if they were looking at the Americas, Spanish and Portuguese gain an enormous amount of prominence in the family, and they feel a little underrepresented. Neolatino also maybe has vowel length, but it's not specified. Like, there's apparently a digraph of 2 O's, but it's not clear how that's pronounced, so my best guess would be vowel length, which would be a strange choice. It could also be a glottal stop, but again, strange choice. Neolatino has complex stress rules inherited from Latin, where stress is either ultimate, penultimate, or antepenultimate, depending on the word. The patterns are complex but pretty regular, and when they aren't, it's marked with an acute. This is good, naturalistic, yet practical design. Neolatino has a very detailed orthography. Like a natural language, letters make different sounds depending on where they are in a word. Familiar to Romance speakers are features like the soft C and G and accent marks. This is the biggest alphabet covered so far on the series, with 43 characters and digraphs. This would be a learning curve, but it's a pretty interesting system once one gets over said curve. Neo-Latino grammar is standard for a Romance language, with all of the complexities that come with that. Because, like I said earlier, Neo-Latino functions more like a new, guided Romance language than a utilitarian fusion of existing Romance languages. The subject pronouns are yo, tú, elle, nos, vos, and ellos. Very simple, and like Romance languages, there are obviously object forms and genitive forms. Side note, since the Universal Glot episode, my technique has shifted less from reading every single aspect of the grammar to more vague musings about its major aspects, leaving the viewer to check it out themselves if they want to know more. Do you like this approach? Neo-Latino has personal conjugation and a pretty intricate verb system, but again, nothing out of the ordinary for Romance speakers. Verbs feature an infinitive of one of a few conjugation classes depending on the ending of said infinitive. This goes back to Latin and is again a common Romance feature. One can then turn that word into a gerund, participle, indicative, subjunctive, or conditional, present, imperfect, past, remote, past, and future, and of course, the imperative. Classic system. No major complaints from the Spanish perspective, but let me know in the comments if this is absolutely terrible for Piedmontese speakers or something. Now, before continuing on to the vocabulary segment, you'll need a minute to hear about today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by the Voiceless Dental Fricative. Use code JPIGEON in the IPA item shop for half off. And after 2 episodes without it, the beloved test is back, comparing the same word in the 8 most spoken Romance languages by native speakers, with the addition of Latin, which has no native speakers. Yet. Neo-Latino does really good here, hitting 7 out of 8 on both. Even though the most common words for dog in Spanish and Portuguese don't match, well-known synonyms exist in both, which are recognizable. Wasn't exactly the Gordian knot to make universal Romance vocabulary, but they took it to heart and succeeded. The number system is typical base 10, understandable here, with the well-known Romance roots. Really, really hard to find anything interesting to say about this number system. It's so piecer. And now for the spoken sample. I didn't find any example texts in Neolatino, so I wrote my own short story, again demonstrating how intuitive it is. R. Uno cane et uno orso camminavan en lo bosco oscuro. Ellos encontraron uno campagnone. Lo campagnone les dijo: "Eu volo que vos exates, vos estes malos." Lo cane le dijo: "Tu oblidaste que non potes camminare." Allora lo orso accidu lo campagnone. Overall, Neolatino is a very good language. Its task honestly wasn't that difficult, so it better have done a quality job. And for the most part it did. Zonal Auxlangs are almost always going to be better at meeting their goals than global Auxlangs, because their scope is less ambitious, even more so if the languages in said zone are actually related. To use examples from the show, if one's task is to make an Auxlang for Romance languages, his goal will be much easier to meet than, say, an Auxlang for unrelated East Asian languages, and his goal will be much easier to meet than a global Auxlang, and even his goal will be much easier to meet than a universal Auxlang. Linkos episode coming soon. And Tino meets its goals in that it feels like a naturalistic yet guided evolution of Vulgar Latin. It isn't as optimized as possible, and that was never the point. It's also very comprehensible to Romance speakers, or at least to me as a Spanish speaker. Perhaps the speakers of the more divergent Romance languages would struggle, but still, as far as I can judge, they did well. And this is more minor, but the orthography just looks really, really cool. Now, I don't want to be known as a glazer, so we must move on to the cons. The sound system of Neo-Latino could have been improved, in my opinion. Gemination, while very based, seems like a bad choice. There were also some other troubles, like the rhotic. As well, the presentation being in Neo-Latino was not very accessible to English speakers, which, it's fair, it's not for us, but like it or not, English is the modern lingua franca for almost 1 billion people, and it's kind of the standard if you want something to actually spread online. Finally, Neo-Latino wasn't that successful in its goal to represent every Romance languages. The whole thing seems a lot more like Italian than any of the others. Not to mention, the Americas were pretty ignored. It's fine that Spanish and Portuguese didn't get special treatment, but why did Italian? Spanish and Portuguese have almost 100 times more native speakers. And don't forget the Haitian Creole erasure. In the end, Neo-Latino is very good at meeting its relatively unambitious goals. While I like Kotava a lot more as a language in a vacuum, it meets its goals of being a global IAL worse than Neo-Latino meets its goals of being a Romance IAL. Who knew moving the finish line closer helps you win? This makes Neo-Latino Romance the best interlang I reviewed so far. Leave any suggestions in the comments below. And stay tuned for next week when the episode will be on Bliss Symbolics.